So welcome to those of you in the class for our last class for the semester, and to the presenters today for our mini-symposium, and to guests. So this morning I've got a lineup of 7 speakers who'll each speak for 10 minutes. Our first speaker we've got today is Dr Mandy Trueman, and so she's currently working with NTG in the Department of Land and Resource Management. She did her PhD at University of Western Australia, looking at how we use remote sensing and GIS in the Galapagos for looking at different ecosystems for vegetation management. And she's going to talk about some of her current work within NTG.
So I'm talking about mapping land resources over a big landscape, the Northern Territory. And when we talk about land resources in the Northern Territory government, this is how we map land resources, and we talk about landform, soil and vegetation. Those 3 are all really important for knowing how we might want to use land, and also for monitoring what's happening in the land and the vegetation, and also for managing the land. So types of landforms that we have in the Territory include hills, rises, wetlands, plains, and various different types of plains. Other places in the world there's a lot more varied landforms, but we don't have volcanoes in the Territory. Soil, different types of soil that we have in the landscape, and then different types of vegetation. Some of the types we have in the NT include grasslands, eucalypt forests, and in terms of remote sensing, vegetation can also help us to figure out what the soil might be underneath the vegetation. So this type of eucalypt forest might indicate that there's quite deep, good quality soil underneath that we might want to clear the vegetation to be used for agriculture. Other types of vegetation we want to know about, like monsoon forest, like this, that we want to protect it, might be really good habitat for certain species. And then other types like acacia shrublands that might indicate something about how the land has been managed. So they're all important aspects of land resources. So we're talking about really big areas. Is anyone here from New South Wales or has ever lived in New South Wales? Yes, Andrew. Well, the area that we're mapping in this project is outlined in black on that slide there, and it's bigger than New South Wales. It's a very large area. So it's very broad mapping. So we're looking at doing it at a scale of about 1 to 250,000. Now, the green lines that you can see on the top part of the map is 1 to 250,000 mapping for the northern part of the Territory. We do have land resource mapping at finer scales in certain areas, but this is talking about broad scale mapping over the whole of the Territory. The yellow lines on the southern part of the map is 1 to 1 million mapping, and this is based on really old surveys, last century, done at a scale of approximately 1 to 1 million. And that's called land systems mapping. I'll explain what a land system is in a second. So there are a few issues with that mapping. I'll just zoom into an area to show you. Now, over here, have a look at that polygon. Can anyone tell me if they can see a particular issue with that, the line around that polygon?
In the wrong place.
In the wrong place. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so there's a few line work issues with this old mapping. So it's meant to be outlining this feature here. And that's just one example. So to describe what a land system is, it's a recurring pattern of component parts that have certain landform, soil and vegetation characteristics. I don't want you to read that bottom bit there, but this diagram just is an indication of what the Woonora land system is. It's a spinifex covered plain, but it also has some hilly parts and some different types of plains in there. So they're actually really good descriptions that were written in the 1940s and 50s, but the components aren't mapped. So in terms of managing the land and using the land, it's not that useful. So the idea, so here this is the most of the big polygon in the middle there is Woonora, but we don't know which bits of the spinifex plains, which bits of the hills, and so forth. So the idea with this project is to, because we have such great remote sensing data available to us these days, it's really far advanced on what was available in the 1940s and 50s, we can use that data to create better mapping. And in this project, we don't really have a budget for collecting data in the field, but we have a lot of existing data that can be used to help us do this mapping. So we have the existing land systems mapping that I talked about. That's the yellow lines on the previous slides. We have some ground data points and we have land unit mapping. On this map here, the black dots are ground data, so that's been collected in the field. that we have stored in a database and that's got soil, landform and vegetation usually. And the blue areas are the areas that have finer scale mapping, and that's usually called land unit mapping because it's the components of the land systems that are actually mapped out. So that's actually quite good quality mapping, and we can use that to guide our in-between type of broad mapping that we want to do that's a bit more accurate than the old land systems maps. And then of course we have a whole lot of remote sensing data available. So we've got digital elevation model, of which there's some other derivatives as well, so slope and relief. So we've got 4 of those layers. We've got some radar data as well. This is all data sets that we have readily available to us to use in the government. So radar data tells us about vegetation and whether it's woody, so whether it's trees or not trees. Some Landsat data as well. And so we can look at that in terms of the colours, so true colours, so we can just look at it visually and interpret quite a lot from that. And then it tells us about soil. We've got various layers that tell us about greenness. There's also a water layer that's derived from Landsat as well, so how much water is in the landscape. So we've got 7 bands of Landsat plus 5 derived layers. And so in total, I've been using 18 layers for analysis. And so just zooming into, the grey area there is the Barkly tablelands, so big grasslands. And I'm just going to go through an example here. Have you guys used eCognition? No? Not at all. All right, so eCognition is a very fancy remote sensing software. I think it's fancy anyway. But it's a bit complicated sometimes. I can't actually see what time I'm up to. Sorry, Karen. So I'm just, that little square in the middle, I'm just going to take you through an example there. So this is a true colour representation of a little part of the Barkly. So the grey areas are grasslands. Oh, thank you. And the greener, darker areas are sort of low rises, or laterite type soil with woodlands and shrublands on them. And then also these reddish areas are the sort of alluvial plains with some woodland on it. And you can see here they're the yellow lines that actually map the land system, the old land systems mapping. So you can see that they don't align all that well now that we're zoomed in. And so first of all, in eCognition, I did a segmentation. And it's really nice because rather than having to draw lines, I guess traditional mapping, we draw lines around the edges of these features. It groups pixels that are similar and draws lines around them and makes these segments that then we can use from there. And from there, we need to be able to give a class to each of those segments so we know what each segment of the landscape actually is. So we did have, in this case, we had some field observations and selected the green points, the red points and the writing are all the field observations. Selected some sample segments of areas that we knew what they were, what they consisted of in terms of vegetation and soil and landform. And then used something called a random forest classifier. I'm not going to explain what that is, but it's a pretty nice tool. And it's a bit like magic. It comes out with this map. And I know, sorry about the colours, they're not very pretty, but I know what they mean. And so the purple areas are essentially grasslands, and green is shrublands and woodlands, and these are woodlands as well, and the alluvial system's the yellow. So just to show you a little bit how that relates to the patterns on the landscape. So that's quite an improvement on the yellow lines that we had earlier. And then just zooming out to the whole of the study area, that Barkly tableland area there had about 12 land systems that cover that area that relate to the Barkly tablelands. But as you remember, each of those land systems has component parts. So now with this mapping, that is actually still a draft, I tell you, it's not finished yet. There's 30 classes that each have unique landform, soil and vegetation. And there's still a lot of work to do because that's the little area that I've been working on so far. Now, we have actually made some progress on these areas here, pretty much this top quarter, I guess. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you for listening. The time frame. Oh, that's a good question, actually, because my boss keeps asking me that as well. And And I'm working on this with a colleague, and it's one of those never-ending projects that it was started because it was seen as something simple, but I guess there's a bit of a lack of understanding of how difficult remote sensing can be and dealing with remotely sensed data. I guess there can be a perception that we have great data and we can just all of a sudden derive something from it with the click of a button, but it's not quite that easy. So it's the Berkeley section will be completed by the end of June, and from there we'll adjust and see how we progress with the rest of it. I think it's quite transferable, but I've started on the Berkeley area because we did have some ground data and a good understanding of the landscape. It will be really interesting to see how then we progress to areas that don't have as much ground data. But I think I think we can do it, but how valid it will be, that's the other question. The question was, will there be ongoing monitoring of these areas? And that is one of the reasons why we need to create these maps, actually, is because there is ongoing monitoring, particularly, I mean, the major land use in terms of area in the Northern Territory is pastoral, and Grant will talk more about that in his presentation.